Hi, welcome to Habitual Excellence presented by Value Capture. I'm Mark Graban. We have a very special guest today. He is Paul O'Neill Jr., and we are going to hear some thoughts and reflections here as we're at the one-year anniversary of the passing of his father. So, Paul, thank you for being a guest here today. Thanks for joining us.
Mark, thanks so much for having me as a guest. I'm honored to be part of Value Capture. And it's great to be one of your colleagues. I've kind of held off on doing a podcast with you because I feel like there's been so many really great ones to do, and why throw me in the mix until maybe the right time and the anniversary of Dad's passing, which will be Sunday the 18th, is a great time to do this. So thanks for having me.
Well, sure, and thank you for doing that. And so I think first question, like intentionally open-ended. What are some first thoughts or reflections that come to mind here on this anniversary?
Okay, great question. So, for me, the journey, Dad's life journey, is a fascinating one. The last, starting about 3 years ago. When he was diagnosed with his illness, which was a lung condition. It's actually diagnosed in 2014 with a pulmonary fibrosis, which is kind of a debilitating, condition. Being with him during that journey and watching somebody who's, a vital person, anybody who knew him, he wasn't like a giant in stature. He was maybe at best, he was 5'9". When I was a kid, when I was maybe 12 years old, I was taller than him. And he'd pat me on the head and he'd be like, I'm still your father. He'd still wipe you out, whatever. But but watching him go through like the end of life journey was really something. And getting to be there with him for those 2 years, which was, I'll give it the 2-year kind of mark, was he got diagnosed with, he had some nodules in his lungs. And so being with someone who had this like strength for life and lots of energy, always, kind of famously up at, 5:30 every morning in the office by 6:30, after going through Ritter's for a coffee, a small cup of orange juice and a dry piece of toast. I'm kind of famous for that. Watching this person with all this gusto, then start to recognize like, hey, I'm in a fight here. But we really made it, my sisters and I, my mother, I think we made it a really, I'm thinking about it in a really positive way. Like I wouldn't trade it for anything. And what he did it with grace. Like he said, we had a minister come, a friend of mine from our church, come to his house. And he met Dad a couple of times. The younger guy, he's probably a little bit younger than me. 50, and he's a brilliant guy, Reverend Kevin Long. And so Dad had met him a couple of times, just briefly at church. A couple of times he'd been a guest at our church. And so he knew the Reverend a little bit, but Dad's thoughts, Kevin's asking him like, how do you feel like about where you are? And this is maybe December of 19. So he's on his way out. Right. And he had kind of checked himself into bed. Dad, like, he announced to us in mid-December, he'd tell my mother, he's like, Nancy, like, I'm not getting up again. Like, this is where I'm going to be. And obviously he didn't die for 3 months. And I did get him out of bed a couple of times to come downstairs to, I said, well, we'll all come over, but, we can't all fit in your house to watch Super Bowl. So if you're going to have to come downstairs, I'll come down for that. So I coaxed him out of bed a few times, but I tell this because it's kind of interesting watching somebody go through the end of their life, and it's tough when it's your father, but when he was with Rev Kev, it was great because he knew he was going. It wasn't like, I'm going to get better here. And he said, I just want to go out gracefully. I don't want to be, I know I'm a burden to my family, but they've accepted that burden. And he was super appreciative of that. And he did a pretty good job. It's hard when your body's breaking down and you're like, hey, I'm, all of a sudden I can't really walk, and I'm someone's helping me eat, and like I'm like, Paul's here, maybe he can help me change my t-shirt. I mean, it's kind of like you know, the tough part of the exit. But anyway, he did do it with grace, and he did. His mind was really good until the end, and I got some videotapes that we did. We videotaped that prayer session, which was awesome. So maybe that's a share with you, Mark, at some point. We can see how we might use that in another podcast. But I also had two shots of taping him talking to friends at the end, where I had the video going, and he didn't know it, and it was tasteful. So it wasn't like I wasn't violating any son father privilege in taping a conversation. But this is like in maybe late mid February anyway, and he is still money on principles, talking about healthcare and why systems are broken still, and his quest for it to be better. That was undying in him. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit, but I think it's that end of life part was as I think about it now was really a special thing to share, and then to like it was crazy. So he passes at 7:30 in the morning on a Saturday, and I know to call Ron Suskind. With kind of he and I talked about when he passes, let me know. I said I'll let you know, Ron, and then he would kind of call the New York Times. He'd be the tip for the media.
Ron Suskind, the author, for people who maybe don't know him and the connection to your dad. Yeah. Right.
And so he wrote the bio of my father after he left the Bush 43 administration. So, which is a great read. So, and I really have a lot of respect for Ron. So anyway, Ron helped me out. But so I called Ron at 8:00. And by 2:00, I'd already talked to like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the AP, like all these people had called. And the surreal part of his passing was like, you've got all this energy to be with Dad for this time, and then he's gone. And then, the folks come from the funeral home, and they pick him up, and it's all perfectly done. He's out of the house probably by like 10:00. And by 2:00, I'd done all these interviews, and I sit down, and my mother's there, and we're like, wow, he's gone. And it's like this real, anyway, it's an intense feeling, but then it's like, you're like, okay, next. And you start thinking about his legacy almost immediately. And actually the value capture through our colleagues, Helen, Zach, and the communication team, you're on that group, obviously, and Melissa Moore and Ken Siegel and Jeff, all of us kind of in the leadership group and part of the communication team had a plan in place to like, what's next? And so it's kind of strange when your parent is that a public enough figure where you're not just sitting there at that 2:00 hour with your mother, like, okay, let's have lunch and let's think about our own grief. You're like the messaging coming in on the internet and all the obits were, it's when someone like Paul, when Dad dies, you don't pay to put them in the New York Times, the obit, like they've written it. You've met with the journal person at the office when he's still alive, and they're doing their bio update, their obit update, if you will. And, it's kind of a surreal experience to be part of that. So a year out, I would say, obviously there's a void, but it's a good thing for me. It's a positive. I tried to make it a really positive thing. My mother's still here, obviously, which is a great thing.
Right.
And the memories are terrific. And the things that he did that were his work life are obviously still there for everybody to share and continue to learn from, as we're doing with habitual excellence and with, obviously Dad's, a big element to all of this.
Right.
And what we do at Value Capture, Ken and Jeff and myself, we wouldn't have started Value Capture without him. He was our non-exec chair. He said to me, like, he said to me, he's like, I'm glad you guys are going to do this, but I don't want to be like, I'm never going to a sales meeting. I'm not doing that. I still want to do conferences. I still want to tell the story, and I still want to try to inspire people, but I don't want to run a business, and I don't want to meet with you and the lawyers to get it set up. And like, I don't want any part of it. And it shouldn't be named the Paul O'Neill capture group. It's going to be,
Yeah.
you guys need to do this. And so it was really cool. He made it safe for me to be part of it because people could say like, oh, here's this nepotistic situation where Paul Jr. has no, what standing does he have to do this? And Dad was like, forget all that. Just, be yourself. You have a gift, and you and Ken and Jeff need to pull your gifts together and start this firm. And it's the right thing. And it's kind of a legacy of the Regional Healthcare Initiative in Pittsburgh, which is a terrific organization that many of our original folks came from. And, he did it with such respect for all of us. And he gave us the room to be like, hey, the rope's around your neck, if you will, on being successful. And, he didn't try to Bigfoot us with like, oh, here's $1 million to start your business. We just did it. We didn't ask him for money. He did help us. He offered help a couple times when we were in some thin years, and he was helpful. But it was really that encouragement to keep going and to not stop. And one thing he said to me that's in my that I taped was, I asked him, I'm like, what have we missed? Like, I got a chance, like at the end, because his mind was still so good. Like, hey, Pop, what did we miss? Like, what are we? Like, I know you would have probably told me already. I hope you would have told me already. But like, what could we do differently? And he's like, just keep going, because your pathway is the right one. Your questions to leaders are the right ones. You all know collectively who's real and who's not. He talked a lot about that. That's maybe another topic we could go to at some point. But like he would call about like a leader being real. Like, are you really, like, are you the talk? Are you the person with the annual report that says, I care about people the most, but you don't know what your OSHA numbers are? That always freaked Dad out. And every company says people is their most important asset. And he's like, I don't know if I believe you if you don't know your OSHA number. So he was great about that, and just in supporting us that way. So, for me, the 1 year out legacy or thoughts about Dad's passing is to keep going. And at 56, I'm here to keep going for a good stretch, and to keep being part of value capture and keep hoping to find people that want to strive toward excellence and toward really theoretical limit achievement, and so that part feels really good. That part's totally intact. Yeah. So we miss him that he's gone. Yeah. But everything he left us, the trilogy, the press toward theoretical limit goals, the press toward the truth, and facts. Like, facts matter to him so much. Yeah. He's you can't, when you start there, it's hard to go wrong. If you challenge yourself, feel like you're getting off the rails, you can maybe think of 4 or 5 things Dad taught us, and you would say, well, so I have some clarity, because mostly he give you clarity. Most of the time, his questions gave you clarity. Yeah. If you had the facts and you're honest with yourself. Yeah. So you talk about legacy, and there's a website I'll invite people to go check out, pauloneillegacy.com. Has so many stories that his people from different aspects of his life had shared, so people can go and check that out. And when you say the trilogy, you mean his 3 questions? Yeah, I call it the 3 questions. Yeah. So I mean, it's so fundamental for somebody to be able to say that what they do adds meaning to their life. So focusing on the 3rd element, but like, that's a tough one, because I think young people have a tough time with that one, and I because they're just in their life journey, right? So if you just graduate from university, like my 2 sons have graduated in the last couple of years, it's hard to say, like, being the low associate in a commercial real estate group, like, what I do adds meaning to my life, like, because kids don't think that. Well, I don't say kids, but like, young people, if you haven't heard it or thought about it or been exposed to somebody that might share that kind of thought with you, you wouldn't. I don't think people put it that way. They're like, I get a paycheck or I don't, or like I know when my boss likes me or not. But like the idea that obviously being treated with dignity and respect every day. If you're not, you know it. Like if the person that's your superior isn't doesn't treat you with dignity and respect, that's a big barrier to getting to the third question, which is, do you feel like just what you do have meaning to your life? But I think exposing people to those three questions is really important. And I've had a chance to guest lecture once so far at IU, Indiana University, where the public policy school is named after Dad, where when you're talking to 23 and 24-year-olds, they're just learning to think about their careers. And if you're still in school, maybe you've been out for a little while, had some job exposures as a younger person, but you're not necessarily in your mid-career yet. The three questions can be tough, but the more people we can expose it to, the better I think people will be. I like how we do it with folks when we engage people, and I love it that I've seen it. And I was it happens maybe once a year, maybe every 18 months, where I'll get a text from somebody, like just a random friend or an acquaintance I have, and they'll have a picture, and the last one was a picture of the three questions. And it was Gary Kaplan from Virginia Mason talking about the relevance of the three questions. And you're like, that's kind of cool, because Kaplan's got his own game that's obviously huge. He's been running a system for many years. He's
20 years, I think. Yeah.
20 plus years he's been there. Yeah. And I had a chance to go with Dad to Virginia Mason, which was awesome, with a couple of folks from Rand, maybe almost 15 years ago now. That was awesome. And I think Gary at that point had been already done, I think he'd done 8 or 10 years already of bringing folks over to Japan. Was kind of one of his lead strategies for engaging folks in leadership progression and growth, if you will. But this is maybe 18 months ago, and his friend screenshots me a picture of a slide that Kaplan's got up, and it's got Dad's picture and the three questions, and you're like, that's awesome, because if it's coming from other leaders that have their own terrific standing, that they're including Dad's elements of Dad's leadership thought in their work, then that's special. So I like that. It's happened a couple of times in different settings. Pretty cool.
Well, I'll put the text of those questions in the show notes for people who might not be familiar with those. But I'm guessing the students were. I mean, one reaction would be to be impressed that your dad was talking about the need for dignity and respect, regardless of any defining personal characteristic. Because they thought, I mean, in a way, those are timeless principles. It's a form of the golden rule, but in a way, he might have been ahead of his time as a corporate CEO, talking about issues like that. About the need for dignity and respect.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it goes back to him trying to unify folks around kind of unarguable thoughts. Like the golden rule is a great example of that. So you can argue with these, kind of some of these key maxims and tenets, and obviously his safety, his quest for perfect safety at Alcoa, and he was really trying to do it at IP before at International Paper when he was there. But he wasn't the boss. He wasn't the CEO. He was the president of the firm, and his superiors and the board, I think, at IP got what his journey was about, what he was talking about. But until you're the one in the seat and you're only answerable to your, at that point, I guess if you're looking at it from a governance standpoint, your board and your shareholders, if you're a public company CEO, but his take was like, now I'm answerable first to my employees. And so that's why when he, jots down safety at the top of his yellow pad when he's going to take the Alcoa job as the, safety of the employees as his number one thing, like for him, that was an unarguable goal that, who raise your hand, he would famously say, if you want to get hurt at work tomorrow, to be the person that's in that last bit of fraction of, your harm in your industry. No one's going to want to get hurt. So,
Right.
so he was really good at framing that message, and already a really terrifically safe place out in Alcoa, but he had great numbers before he got there. Famously, he told the analysts in his first analyst meeting on Wall Street that safety was his number one goal, and people were like running for the phones, like, sell this stock, this guy's crazy, because it's, how can you be this industrialist and you're talking about worker safety as going to be the, the prime driver of your performance in your first meeting? And people really thought he was maybe, he was like, had this soft, public, he had his being a person in government, like he had this aspirational kind of element to him that was like, this is business, man. And so he never wavered. Like, it was not like he never questioned. There is no evidence that he ever questioned that strategy. Yeah. Like no one's ever questioned him, or I've never read anything other than the people that didn't get it at first, but the proof was there. There's no doubt about that. So,
yeah, it seems like there was a real strength to not cave into peer pressure or the norms of how things are typically done. It seems like his principles in his worldview were so solid. He wasn't going to be swayed from that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's so much of him that, he got, like, from one of his favorite people. We could do an influencer podcast at some point, but one of his favorite people that believed in him as his boss was President Ford, and they had a fantastic relationship. And Ford totally got it. Like, he totally bought into Dad's way of being this, like, facts on the ground, knowledgeable person. The thing that makes Dad, that made him, where you couldn't really argue with him when he was in the public sector, was that he was this budget analyst from 1961, right? So he by 1974, when he's the deputy director at OMB under President Ford, no one knew the numbers better than him, because no one had lived that granularity that he did, that you couldn't argue facts with him. Like, he just had it. It was in his head. And I have the proof. It's in my office, in his papers, of different runs of numbers where you look at these books of just that, like, this total granular, like, why this little budget element was he knew the numbers, and it was uncanny how well he knew the numbers. And you just, of course, you get it, and it's kind of a Gladwellian, like, if you do the 10,000 hours, well, if you do the 20,000 hours or whatever it is that Dad did, or I don't know, I'd be curious to figure out the number of hours that Dad spent on it, but you can't beat him. So, like, Ford notoriously, so one interesting piece that I have that Dad saved was I think it was from, like, the Detroit Free Press, and Ford had just launched his campaign to get elected, right? He's this president who comes in under a resignation. He's the only president we ever had that was not elected to either be vice president or president. And so Ford's trying to prove himself, and he goes to Detroit to kick off his campaign. And who does he have with him? Dad. And they get off the plane, and the press is there, and they hammered Ford for this in an op-ed that was about basically saying, wow, so Jerry Ford shows up to run for re-election, and he's got this number cruncher with him, because no one knew who Dad was in the world in 1976. In running an election or campaign, no one knew who Paul O'Neill was. I mean, if you were a policy wonk, or you were like a Washington, you really wanted to understand insiders, okay, you would know who Dad was. But Dad was he was one of a half a dozen people that kind of fit a role like that. So this op-ed's written, and the reason I know about it is because somebody sent it to him in 1976 and said, holy hell, look at the trouble we're in, because you're the one that's with Ford. So it's written in the margin of this article that this person who lives in Detroit is calling out Ford for saying, you're such a fool. How are you going to win if you've got Paul O'Neill there? And they sent it to Dad as a dig. But Dad saved it as like, hey, this is proof of my, like my value to President Ford. And so I don't know if I've ever told you that story before, Mark, but it's kind of, it's really cool that this, like, Dad would save these kind of things. Like you would think like, oh, that's something I'm going to throw away. Like, why would I want anybody to know about that? and Dad, like for him, it was a cool reminder of like, hey man, I was there and I was picked for a reason. And so I'm sorry, I went down a rabbit hole there a little bit.
That's right.
But it's a really cool proof of like the relationship that Dad had with Ford, and how, as an influencer and someone that treated Dad with that, again, go back to the three questions, like dignity and respect. Do I get, do I have the tools I need to do what I'm to do my job, and am I recognized for it? And so really, I think that Ford was the one who solidified that message for Dad, because that's how he felt.
Yeah. And this is speculation or alternate history. Had Ford won the 76 election, your dad might have had a bigger role in that administration?
Yeah, for sure. He would have been the chief of staff. So that was, for sure. And not unarguable, like that would have been his role. Okay. And it was interesting. I know that Carter asked him to be, like, are you interested? There was like a little, because Dad had been a bureaucrat all these years. So and been part of the, he would only been he'd only been in an appointed position since 72, maybe. So he hadn't really had to declare himself. And so a lot of those kind of insider people kind of went between, administrations. And so, no, Dad would said, no, I don't want to do that. And he's like, I need to go make some money, because he was, at that point, I think he was, if you were his level job in the government, you were making maybe $38,000 a year. And so you weren't, in 1976 dollars, that's not terrible, but that's not what you're making on the outside. So he left the government, went to international paper, and we moved. And I remember we moved once when I was a kid, because I think we moved to a different neighborhood. I think partly because my dad wanted to get the equity out of the house that we were in, a little bit of it because my oldest sister was going off to college. She was going to Clemson, and they just didn't have a lot of extra money. So, Dad, people will say, oh, didn't you grow up in this, they assume I grew up in this country club setting because of Dad's success later on. But, when I was a kid, at that time, Dad drove an orange Pinto, 71 Pinto, and my mother drove a station wagon. And so it wasn't like which is fine, which is great. We're lucky to have what we did. Yeah. But, there wasn't a lot of extra cash laying around or, whatever. So it was interesting to see how he navigated his career. And he was actually really on top of it. He knew every level of I think he really knew what his opportunities were. And I think he decided, I want to take this other, a private job, because it's not only for the financial potential reward, but because I want to kind of just see what that's about. And so he went he went in as like the head of planning for IP, and ended up as the president over a course of years. He held maybe 6 different jobs there, but 4 or 5 different jobs. But he appreciated that progression and being in the private sector. Yeah. And of course, ended up at Alcoa in 86, 87. So.
Right. Up until he left Alcoa to join 43's administration. So he had a good long run at Alcoa. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was retiring, actually. So we went to a retirement dinner in New York with a handful of us, family, and then a month later, the election is over. So I got a call. It's December probably 19th. I forget when the Supreme Court decided when that decision came down, and Gore withdrew essentially, and 43 became president. That Dad was, originally I think they'd been floated that, hey, maybe you'd be the commerce secretary, or we'll give you something else. And he's like, I'm not interested. It wasn't even, no one called him. And then finally Cheney calls him and says, hey, it's not commerce or OMB. It's Treasury. Are you coming? And so he gave him something to think about, because he was really effectively going to be retired.
Yeah.
Maybe the more interesting political piece is when Bush 41 gets elected, and Dad was very close with 41. He calls Dad. Dad been at Alcoa for, it's 88 when Bush wins. Mm-hmm. And Dad was not a Reagan guy, because Reagan was not a Ford. So Dad wasn't actually Ford. Reagan had Dad as in a commission, and he met Reagan several times and helped with certain things, but he was not going to be in the Reagan administration. But when 41 wins, so Bush 41 wins, and he calls Dad and he says, "Why don't you come?" I think the quote is essentially, Baker's going to be at State, and Schultz is going to be part of this, but what do you want? And so and then you go back and look at New York Times front page. At that time, the leak was that he would be the Secretary of Defense, that Dad would be offered that position.
Wow.
And he famously says, no, I don't think, I'm not interested. And so Cheney ends up in that job.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of interesting, what would history be like if Dad had said yes to that job that time. But he wasn't going to leave Alcoa, which is the real point, which was he was honored to be the CEO of Alcoa. Mm-hmm. He'd only been there a brief time. And he said, I want to stay. I want to do this. I made a commitment, and the board brought me in as the first outsider ever to run Alcoa. Alcoa had always picked someone from the inside to be the CEO, and he famously says no. And so anyway, we won't play the history from some other time.
Yeah, but again, it sounds like that was a principles-based decision. He made a commitment. He was going to stick to it, and he did great work, of course, at Alcoa. And people can read about that in at least Charles Duhigg's version of that in the book The Power of Habit, and then the Ron Suskind book, which I had a chance to read a year or two ago, The Price of Loyalty: George W. Bush, the White House, and the Education of Paul O'Neill. That's out there on Amazon for anyone who is interested in looking at that. So, Paul, I hope we can do other episodes for sure. There's a lot we can dig into. One final question I was going to ask for today: given your dad's passion for safety and extending that to patient safety, and the role of leaders and systems, I'm curious. Do you know if he had any other observations, during the last couple of years of his treatment? He was spending a lot of time with different parts of the healthcare system. Did it reinforce or open his eyes in different ways that you know of?
For me, it was being there by his bedside in a lot of these cases. And actually, he had a quad bypass in 2007 that he, thank God he ended up having a heart attack. But it was kind of one of those things where he was in danger, but he wasn't, I guess. So he was lucky it wasn't a widowmaker situation, or he wouldn't have made it past 07. But he was great. His observation skills were so good, right? So anybody who's ever spent any time with him in a hospital, him observing people in frontline, he's really good observation skills. And so, of course, he was a great observer of his own care. And he would say, like, boy, the opportunity's still here. The opportunity's obviously still here. And he does the numbers, and he's like, in his mind, you get 30% waste. It's still the same or more. And so, his quick math is, what would you do with $1 trillion if we could cut that out of our, out of the waste out of that system, and think of all the things we could do with that money.
Yeah.
And I know that the numbers have only grown over the years. So it's, what would we do with those resources to help people that need help? Because his answer was always about, if you created more financial capability, who could we help? Right? It wasn't about turn it over to shareholders necessarily, right? So most people think of productivity and they think of, well, the shareholders are going to do better. And, Dad was all about, certainly, especially in healthcare and in education, and all the thoughts he has about improvement always led to who else could we help next? And so actually his observation didn't change at all. So a short answer, and to anybody that got a chance to be on a unit with him, of providing any healthcare, could tell that he could see it, and he just wanted other people to learn how to do that. So I love what Value Capture does. One of our key first couple day experiences with leaders is to have that observation experience and see, because most places focus on, obviously we know they focus on the big things that happen, and oh my goodness, wrong site surgeries and like the things you read about in the paper. The things you don't read about in the paper, the things that where Dad felt the opportunity was the greatest, right? Like med pathway redesign was always in his mind, and that was forever being, confirmed in his by just watching what happened with him, and the opportunities for places to think about being better. I as an investor, I love McKesson's stock over the years, but putting robots in pharmacies drove Dad nuts because a human being had to load the pills into the robot for them to be distributed to people. So if you think about the processing of floating a robot, that always made Dad crazy. So
quick story. I was in a hospital pharmacy once, and I asked how much labor did they save because they put in the robot, and the person I asked, they started to turn a little green.
Yeah.
And the answer was, we had to add labor. To your point about it took more people to run the pill repackaging machine than were saved by the robot. So,
and you still have the pharmacy check, and then you still got to be delivered, and then it's just it's fascinating. Yeah. So Dad was always able to break those things down into a bare form, and he tried to do it safely. Like I did it not quite safe right there. I mean, no offense to people that are in those jobs, obviously, and I met them side by side with them many times, and fell, and I'm actually in Tennessee right now doing this podcast, and at Wellmont, about an hour from here where I am now, I got to spend a bunch of time in the pharmacy with Lisa Beckwith and Leslie Korak and our colleagues, and think about redesign, and it was always like, oh my God, this is a very difficult job, and that robot's not helping anything here. So anyway, but I say with all respect for anybody that's in the process. It's really about to Dad. It was always the lack of respect that some of the elements of these pathways of care threw off, and that he saw was the opportunity. Yeah. So anyway.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for taking some time and sharing some reflections, and I do look forward to having other conversations with you whenever you like. So just let me know.
Absolutely.
But we're I know a lot of the listeners and a lot of the other guests, a lot of the listeners they're listening because they were impacted by your dad, and so there are a lot of people thinking about him, thinking about you and the family during this time. So
thanks so much. I'm glad we were able to do this, and any time I can
me too.
Be on and we can dig in more, that'd be great.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.